Leadership Matters conversation. This week we have been celebrating Race Equality Week 2023. My name is Diana Belfon, and I'm the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Specialist for Integrated Care Northamptonshire. Today, the session will be facilitated by myself, as well as with my great colleague, Anne Linsell, who is our organisational development consultant. Now, before we start the session, we would just like to run through a few housekeeping rules with you. We would like to encourage you to leave your cameras on. It's always good to see those smiling faces, and it's great for our speaker to be able to also see who they're speaking to. You will note that your mics have been muted, and the reason for that is so that we can eliminate any background disturbing noises. Now, this is an interactive session, and we absolutely welcome any questions that you may have. Now, you can raise your questions by using the raise hand function within Teams, or alternatively, if you're a little bit shy, you can place your questions in our Q&A inbox. But if you look at the top of the screen, you will notice there is a box called Q&A. If you can pop your questions in there, that will be really good. The chat function will not be used in this session. Now, race equality can raise lots of emotions, and all we ask of you today is just to remind you to be courteous and respectful when raising your questions, and also to maintain that level of professionalism. And just to remind you, the session will be recorded so that our colleagues who weren't able to attend today can watch this session again on demand by visiting our website. So finally, I would like to encourage our colleagues who are hard of hearing, just like myself, to use the live transcription control within MS Teams. There are 3 dots at the top of MS Teams, and if you click that, you can turn on the transcription. So what I'd like to do now is introduce you to Toby Sanders, who's our Chief Executive of Northamptonshire Integrated Care Board. And Toby will then introduce our esteemed speaker. Thank you, Toby. Over to you.
Thank you, Diana, and good afternoon, everybody. Give me a wave, those people I can see on screen. I can see quite a few cameras on out there. It's great to see so many people joining us today for this really important session and important conversation. As Diana said, I'm the Chief Executive of the Integrated Care Board in Northamptonshire, and it's my privilege to lead much of our system work, bringing partners together, many of whom I can see on today's call as well. I can see some chair and chief executive colleagues out there as well who've joined us in today's conversation. We've got a really great mix, I think, of people who are participating and have joined us for this discussion today. Obviously, a lot of colleagues from across the Northamptonshire system, which is brilliant to see so many of our kind of teams and staff within local organisations. That includes NHS organisations across our local system. We've got colleagues from local government. We've got colleagues from the voluntary sector. We've got colleagues from police and other local bodies who've signed up, and I hope many of you have been able to join us today into this conversation. But we've also opened out the wider invite here as well. So I know from folk who've registered outside of Northamptonshire, it's great to have you with us. You're very welcome. We've got colleagues from local government that registered from other areas and also from other NHS organisations. Some nearby and some much further afield in other parts of the country. So wherever you've come from or you're dialing in from today, you're very welcome. It's very good to have you with us and really look forward to your engagement and involvement in what's going to be a really rich conversation and discussion. I'm delighted to be able to, in hosting today's conversation, and I'll come back in a little bit later on to help to manage and facilitate some of the discussion and conversation. But it's my real privilege up front to be able to introduce Patricia Miller, who's going to be our main speaker for today. Patricia, a fellow ICB Chief Executive colleague from another part of the country, and I'm really looking forward to both hearing from Patricia, as I'm sure you all will be, but also to the conversation we can get into on this topic, which of course is so important for everything that we do from a health and care perspective and for our population. And I'm sure all of us would recognise and acknowledge that, in a sense, it's never felt like a more important moment to be having this kind of conversation. If you look at where we are with various issues nationally, internationally at the moment, the kind of importance of race equality, and how we kind of take that into our daily practice and our experience and our lives has never felt more relevant or more important from a health and care perspective. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce and bring into the screen Patricia. Patricia, I'll leave you to introduce yourself more fully, because I know you're going to walk us through some of your kind of journey and your leadership journey and your lived experience from your personal perspective. So Diana, if it's okay, I will hand over to Patricia at that point, and ask you to kind of switch the slides around as well so that we can move into that mode. Patricia, over to you.
Thanks, Toby. God, I look infinitely smarter on the screen in that photograph than I do today. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I've just noted Krishna is one of my chair colleagues, so I'm a bit worried that I might be being marked out of 10 this afternoon. I'm really pleased to be here, actually, to join you for Race Equality Week and hopefully have a really good conversation about how we can all collectively try and improve the experience of not just our colleagues from ethnic minorities, but also the experience of people that we all will know that live in our communities that have to face a daily challenge around being seen as human beings quite often, and those equal in their experiences to others. So the plan today was to probably talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we've got plenty of time to actually have a conversation about how we can all collectively work better and join up better in this space, and happy to field any questions at that point that anyone might have. I'll just put my glasses on, because at my age I am officially blind now in terms of close reading work. So I'm going to talk a bit about my experiences, talk a bit about the context within which we're all living and operating in the UK, and then field some questions afterwards that anyone might want to ask me. And I'm really happy to take any question at all, and I'll try and be as honest and frank as I can, because I don't think we talk about this stuff enough in an open context, which is why we're not moving the agenda forward properly and taking steps that make some real changes. So obviously for me, this is really personal. My father and his mother and his two sisters came here from Barbados in 1963. They were not immigrants. They came when Barbados was still part of the United Kingdom. It was not independent. So I do get really frustrated and irritated when I hear the government talk about the Windrush generation as if they were immigrants, because they were not. They were part of the UK. And as you can imagine, their lives were not easy when they arrived. My dad, on marrying my mum lost a lot of friends who would no longer want a relationship with her because she'd married a black man. For a long time, my grandmother on my dad's side was not supportive of the relationship, and not because she had any feelings of animosity towards my mum, but because she knew that whilst life was going to be hard enough for my dad as a black man in this country, that then entering into a mixed interracial relationship was going to make things harder. And then, of course, I was born and everything changed because she had a grandchild to worry about. My experience of growing up as a child tells me now as an adult that, and I look at the experiences of my children, that not much has changed in 60 years. The exception being that while racism in those days was very overt, now it's much more insidious and undercover, which makes it incredibly difficult to prove when you know deep down inside that someone's response to you is about the colour of your skin, and trying to prove that to particular an employer is really difficult when it's very insidious, the behaviour towards you. Things I remember as a child were moving from a community where there were not many families of colour, but there were 2 or 3 that lived within really close proximity to us. So we had a little bit of a network of of friends. And then we moved to an area where we were fortunate enough to be able to get a house with a garden, and we were the only family of colour in that neighbourhood. And my overriding memories, things that really stick in my head, are coming in from playing outside the house every day, and our next door neighbours immediately that we went into the house washing the garden wall down with bleach, because obviously if we'd sat on it we must have contaminated it. Some neighbours never speaking to us at all. Going to school, coming home from school one day as a 12-year-old walking with my brother who was 11, and because I had brushed against a lady and a toddler that were walking towards me with the toddler outside of the pushchair, that woman hit me in the face and gave me a black eye. And being more frightened actually in the evening at home when my dad came home from work, being more frightened of him being out on the street and finding that person and being arrested by the police, and the person who'd actually assaulted me not being arrested, because in those days, stop and search is bad enough now, but it was rife in those days, and men of my dad's age would regularly be pulled into the back of a police van and literally almost beaten to death for no reason. So when I look forward now into the current times, as I said, I think nothing much has changed, and that really concerns me, because my children go to school and hear the N-word. They go to school and see swastikas put onto benches in the playground. And that's not okay. And it's not okay that before we'd even planned on having the conversation with our children about what their life experiences were likely to be, we were forced at a really young age into having that conversation because of something that had been said to them at school by a child whose parent didn't recognise there was anything wrong with it. I suppose the other reason why it's really personal to me is because I was brought up in a very strong Christian background, like lots of families of colour. My granddad was paternal granddad was a Baptist minister, and my grandmother was a very strong Christian. Both of my maternal grandparents were heavily involved in the local Methodist church, and so the idea of social justice and human rights is a fundamental part of Christianity, and so it means a lot to me as a human being, because the idea that we live in an environment where there isn't social justice and where different parts of our communities are dehumanized all the time doesn't sit well with me. And talking about racism, I remember once when Hillary Clinton, when she became the first lady in America and her husband became president, was asked to go to the United Nations to talk about gender equality. And she opened her speech by saying that she was so frustrated and angry by the fact that the term gender equality kept being used as if it was something extraordinary, because what she actually wanted to talk about was the fact that women's rights were human rights. And the same applies when we talk about race equality. We shouldn't need legislation that makes people do it, because this is about human rights for everyone being seen as equal. Next slide, please. So some facts that I think are really helpful. We use the term ethnic minority all the time, and actually it's really misleading. We may be the majority in the UK, but the reality is that Black and brown people are the majority in the world. And many of the most significant inventions that we hear and read about all the time in world history were actually led by Black and brown people and took place in African countries. And I've put in the slide there for people to read later on what some of those inventions were. And even when we think about Catholicism, when the Pope originally started to train bishops and cardinals, that was done in Mozambique. It was not done in the Western world. So we get a very skewed picture of world history based on what a minority want it to look like, as opposed to what happened in reality. So when the light bulb was first invented. It was actually a black man that invented the filament that made the bulb work. But we never talk about that. We talk about the person that is in our history books that we're supposed to believe invented that thing. So I think when we realise that actually black people have always played a significant part in the development of society, then we have to recognise that we have to continue to play a positive role in the world, despite the fact that there are barriers put in front of us all the time. Next slide, please. So when we think about the context within which we're living in the UK, just some facts for everyone to get their head around, because we hear all the time that, is it really that bad for ethnic minorities? What about white working class boys? What is it like for them? Well, let me just give you some statistics that tell you just how bad it is. So black people are 5 times as likely as white people to be detained under the Mental Health Act. And there are also significantly higher rates of sectioning and being offered or given against their will antipsychotic drugs. That's not because black and brown people have more of a propensity to be mentally ill, as in their physiology, than their counterparts. Part of it is because the daily experience of racism and discrimination affects you to such a point mentally and psychologically that you are more likely to experience anxiety and mental health issues and depression. But more importantly, it decreases your life expectancy by up to 25 years. And that's because when you are worn out on a daily basis, mentally and psychologically, it impacts on your physical health, which means you are more likely to have a stroke or a heart attack or get cancer. So when the government thought they were being really clever in saying that we'll offer COVID vaccinations originally and target the population over 80 because they're most at risk, that's why you probably saw a lot of black and brown people smiling, because we don't live that long. So how is that going to help us? And when the actual outcome of the first wave of COVID was known, and we were much more likely to die of COVID, prioritising that age group gave us no benefit whatsoever. When we look at the overrepresentation of the criminal justice system, minority ethnic individuals are overrepresented throughout the criminal justice system compared with white people. And again, that's not because, as I was told once by a counsellor, that certain ethnicities are more prone to committing criminal acts. That's not the case at all. It's about the way the justice system views us. It's about the environment that our young people grow up in, which pulls them into a gang culture which is not productive for them. If you live in an environment as a teenager where you feel isolated from the rest of society, you look for parts of the society where you're going to feel welcome and valued. They may not be positive places for you to be. The greatest disparity is at the point of stop and search and custodial remands in the prison population. So where I live, you are 9 times more likely to be stopped and searched as a black person than a white person. There was a point in Dorset where you were 37 times more likely to be stopped and searched. That's not okay. And black individuals are often the most overrepresented, particularly males, in prosecutions. And when black and brown people go to court, they're more likely to receive more serious and long-term detention penalties than their white colleagues for the same crimes. And then we think about death in childbirth, which has been a really big focus from NHS England recently. So black women are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth. If you're of Asian heritage, you are 1.8 times more likely to die in childbirth. And again, that's not because we're physically different. It's because we're not listened to in terms of our needs. And it's because the response when we voice concern is that it can't be real, that we have an assumption that we have a higher pain threshold than white women that leads to complications of pregnancy. And again, we've got to address some of that and not just believe that a lot of this is physiological, because it isn't. It's about bias and discrimination and assumptions that are built up by practitioners that look after us that dictate the outcome in terms of our health. So if we take that into a broader context, in November of 2018, Harriet Harman, who chairs the Human Rights Select Committee, ordered a review of all of the reviews that had been done in the last 20 years, I think it was, into the experiences of Black and brown people in the UK. And what she wanted to particularly focus the review on was, of those reviews that had been done, how many of the recommendations had been implemented, how many had not been implemented, and what were the barriers to implementing all of them to shift this agenda on into a more positive space. What she decided to do at the outset of the review was she surveyed tens of thousands of people from Black, African and Caribbean backgrounds and people of mixed heritage from those backgrounds, and she asked them one question, which was, do you feel your human rights are taken as seriously in the UK as white colleagues' human rights? And the overrounding response was no. And when she got into more detail and asked the question why, a standard answer came back, which was, we don't feel we have a right to life, we don't feel we have a right to a decent education, and we don't feel we have a right to a fair trial. And those are basic human rights. The UN have recently, last week, published their review, which they've the second time they've been here in the last 3 or 4 years, to look at racism and its impact in the UK. And their overriding conclusion is that Black and brown people in this country live in fear every day because the system does not care for them. So something has got to substantially change in order to change that position. And given that there are over 1 million people that work in the NHS that all have friends and family, that we have an opportunity to create a social movement in public service that can have a significant impact on the way that society operates. Next slide, please. So my experiences, I've talked a little bit about my upbringing and the experiences of my children. I think when I was at school, my brother and I were 2 of 3 Black children in our upper school. Racist language used by teachers was a regular occurrence. I remember going into 6th form and one of my lecturers referring to a poet that we were studying as a blackie, and trying to have an argument with the head teacher about why he was not referring to a poet by that name. He was actually referring to this poet in a very racist and derogatory way. I think that the experiences I had around being judged, my intellect being judged by my ethnic background and the colour of my skin, as opposed to my actual intellect, I have seen that repeated with my own children. And my children are not perfect, but they work hard to be A students. And there have been occasions where, one, they've been assessed in terms of their intellect incorrectly, not because of any work that they've produced, but an assumption about how bright they could possibly be. I remember when my oldest was in infant school or junior school, one of her teachers telling me she was awful at maths and she would never get any better at maths, and writing a report about her that was more about the fact that we'd, as parents, been to see the head teacher to complain about this woman's attitude towards my daughter, as opposed to her writing a true reflection of Esther as a human being. And I also remember being notified about my youngest being in a drama group at school and how she was part of a group of children that actually were misbehaving, and having a really honest conversation with her. And the fact that she was in the vicinity of that incident, she wasn't actually part of the group, but the assumption that she was the ringleader because she's a Black child, so she must be disruptive to everyone else. And those things really stay with you. And whilst those are not as as anywhere near as serious as some of the incidents that occurred, I think, when me and my brother at school. It's more about the fact that those things still happen, that people still judge individuals based on what they think is going to happen because of the colour of their skin, what they think their behaviours are going to be, and not what they actually observe in practice. And I remember as a 11-year-old, my parents, who were not well off at all, and actually there were, one of the other reasons why I suppose social justice is quite important to me is because the fact that my father was not able to get a reasonably paid job with career progression, because in the 60s and the 70s that wasn't an option for black people. It meant that, one, he remained frustrated for most of his adult life because he wasn't able to achieve the ambitions that he'd set for himself, but also with a low-income family. And in those days, again, my mum was a nurse who earned £7 a week, while her friend was a bus conductress and earned £37 a week. And here we are today with nurses striking over pay. So some things really don't change. There was food poverty in our house, and there were moments when there was a choice for my parents between them eating healthy or us eating healthy as 3 children and them not eating at all. And I remember my mum at 11 saying to me that I was really bright and that I should consider applying for the scholarship for the local private school because there was no way that they could afford to send me there. And the overriding reason why I refused to do it is because I didn't want to repeat the experiences that I had at junior school and be the only black kid in that school, and my life from the age of 11 to 16 being 10 times worse, because not only would I have only been the only kid of colour, I would have been probably one of few kids that didn't have a lot of money either, and I just couldn't face that. And then when I went to sixth form, the experience at sixth form was so bad that I actually took 3 months out of school with anxiety, and returned back to school having missed an opportunity to be to take the Oxbridge exam, which again felt like a really great opportunity, but the overriding feeling for me was, oh my God, I'll also be in Oxford or Cambridge and be in a minority, and I don't want to face that either. But having to take 3 months off school with anxiety because of the environment that I was in and because of the behaviours of some of the teachers, again, was just not okay. And my life could have turned out very different as a consequence. But it hasn't, because I've been really clear about the fact that one of the things, repeated messages that I was given as a child, is that as a child of colour, you have to be twice as good as any of your white friends to succeed. And whilst that can have a two-edged sword, it can set you up for being really hard on yourself in terms of what you achieve. And I am really hard on myself, and I regularly have to have a conversation with myself in a corner about whether I am setting the goals high because of that, and as a consequence they are unachievable, or whether what I'm asking of myself and the teams that I lead is reasonable, and sometimes what I'm asking is not reasonable. But it also means that it gave me a what I'd call probably a steely core, which is that as an adult, as I've got older with more experience, the more people tell me that I can't do something or I can't achieve anything, then I'm more determined to do it. And if I didn't have that as a background in terms of the strength that my family and friends network has given me, my career and my life might have turned out very differently. Next slide, please. So my experiences in the NHS has been very patchy. I can honestly say that I don't think I've ever been discriminated against in terms of career progression because I'm a woman. I've never felt that. But I have felt at times that I have been held back because of my ethnic background. So when I first came into the service, I'd not been in the service for very long, probably 3 or 4 years, and I've never really sat down and planned out my career and thought by the time I get to a certain age I want to be a chief exec. That was never part of the plan. What has been the part of the plan is that every time as I wanted to have the biggest influence that I could on people's lives from a positive perspective, as in giving back to society. And once the sphere of influence or authority that I've had has reached its ceiling in different roles, and I've always looked for the next role to widen that out so I can still do what I want to do around making things better for people. And I remember at one point being very young in my early 20s and starting a new job and already knowing what gaps I needed to fill in order to move on to the job that I really wanted, and saying to my boss that really I wanted to be really honest in my very first induction conversation to say, you know, I'm only planning on being here for X amount of time, because I already know what it is I need to do in order to get to that next job, which is the job that I really want, where I've got a bigger sphere of influence. And him looking at me with this horrible sly look on his face and saying, people like you always say that, and you'll still be here in 5 years. And I'm really pleased that I left 12 months to the day with a nice smile on my face as I went on to the next job. When I became, just before I became a director, I worked in a specialist mental health unit for 5 years, which was officially the best job that I've ever had. And I ended up working for an executive director who used to refer to me when I wasn't around as the Malteser in the team. And I remember complaining to the chief executive at the time and getting absolutely nowhere. And, you know, those instances were repeated all the way through my career, where very senior colleagues use their power to dehumanize you as a human being, in the hope that that's going to create a glass ceiling that stops you from progressing. And I think you've got some choices in that space where you can either try and fight to change things, or sometimes you just have to accept that the values that that organisation has will never align with the values that you have, and you need to choose to leave. And there were some circumstances where I chose to fight, and there were other circumstances where I chose to leave. I got a job once as an information manager in Wakefield. I literally stayed there for 6 months. This was one of the moments where I chose to leave because I hadn't done my homework enough about where I was going to live, and discovered that the organisation that I worked in, that 10 miles down the road were the National Front headquarters. There was absolutely no point in me fighting to change the culture there, because that would not have happened. And so choosing to exit and go and work somewhere else was the right thing to do. There's been moments where I've had no support around professional development at all, and I've had to really fight hard for that. But I'm glad that I did, because it's helped me with the progression that I've had over the last few years. And I definitely think that I've been given roles that were much harder than roles that were given to colleagues, which is a regular occurrence for people from ethnic minority backgrounds, because there's this sense that we've got to prove that we are as good as our white colleagues. And when I decided to take a career break and go to university when I was 30, because I couldn't afford to do that when I was younger, my parents couldn't support me through that. The job that I was doing, when it was advertised after I left, it was advertised as 2 separate jobs, because suddenly there was a realization that one person couldn't carry all of that responsibility. No matter how much I said it when I was in that job, I wasn't listened to. So what did I do as I got older? I think when I became a chief executive, I had a bit of a light bulb moment where I realised that I'd got the position and the power and the voice now to start to make a difference in this space on a much broader footing. And I think that's what I've been doing for the last 7 years, is really using my voice and my position and my power to try and get the centre to change, to try and support colleagues to be able to see the world through a different lens, to acknowledge that our experiences as children and our experiences as adults dictate the lens through which we see the world. And once we know that, then we need to do some work on ourselves as individuals in order to change that perspective to be better human beings around equality. And sometimes that's an easy conversation to have peer to peer than it is to have in a different forum. So I've tried to use the voice that I've now got to do the right thing. And, you know, Krishna will remember that we were at our BME chairs and chief executives network in the very early days, and one of the chairs said to us as chief executives, of course we as chairs have had our careers, and so if somebody decides to sack us, it won't be the end of the world, but for you as chief executives, you've still got mortgages and families. And I remember myself and another colleague saying, actually, there comes a point in your life when you just have to do the right thing. And I feel quite emotional now. And if that means that somebody says to you, well, actually, you're fired. Well, we've got enough length of experience and gravitas to know that there'll be another job round the corner. And holding on to the position is not as important as doing the right thing morally. And so, I mean, I've had that conversation with my children. They are 15 and 17. And that if mum loses her job tomorrow, then things might be a bit difficult for a little while, but at least I'll know that I've gone down fighting, for want of a better expression, because I've chosen to do the right thing over being quiet and silent and being complicit in what I know is wrong. Next slide, please. So the conclusions for me are that when we talk about the NHS's greatest assets being its people, I don't actually think that's true. I think its greatest asset is the relationships that those people can create, that could be, with the right encouragement and support, be based on positive human relationships where we see each other as equals and where we support each other to feel valued and to feel listened to and to feel safe and to be able to be our best selves every single day. Again, I think we talk about what gets measured gets done, and I don't believe that either. I think what gets done is what we're held to account for, and we don't see race equality or any other type of equality and inclusion in the NHS as being a priority, and so we're not held to account for it. And the Equality Act has been in place since 2010. RES has been around since 2012. Every single year we get a staff survey that tells us that Black and brown staff are having a deteriorating experience, and yet we're not seeing it as a priority to do something about it. And for me, it's really clear that there is an intimate connection between leadership, culture and performance. And given the NHS is in some of the most challenging circumstances it's ever been in, it's a bit of a no-brainer as to why we don't do the work we need to do on leadership behaviours and culture, because that's not just how we create safe working spaces for everyone, it's also how we create organisations that outperform other organisations, because we know that organisations that are more diverse, organisations that are inclusive, outperform the ones that are not by 25%. And we also know that when we talk to Generation Z, 82% of them say that they don't want to work for an organisation that's not inclusive. So why are we not just doing this? Why is it not just business as usual? And then there's a final thought in my mind, which is racism for me isn't about how society views Black and brown people. It's about how it views whiteness as being superior. And that needs to change, because we can't do this on our own. We can't make this change on our own. The people that can make this change are white colleagues, because they can stop others seeing whiteness as being superior. And if we're intentional about it, then we can really start to see things change for the positive. And I think that's the last slide. Thanks.
Patricia, thank you so much for that. Diana, thank you for dropping down the slides as well. Just going to take a moment because actually, Patricia, there's a number of people around the screen that are just kind of saying thank you in their own way. Three things really struck me just before we kind of come into conversation and bring people in. And I should say, if people would like to make a comment, ask a question, feel free to raise your hand, and I'll kind of host this next bit of the conversation and bring people in turn. So if you want to signal that, just let me know. Three things really struck me in particular, Patricia, listening to your story, your journey, your kind of testimony. Firstly, I don't think I've been on a Teams call that I can recall in recent times when I've seen people listening so intensely to what you were saying and reacting in the way that people were through the course of that. I think just a big thank you from me and from them for being so open in your experiences that you shared, and for being so vulnerable in the way that you've just done that. The second thing I'm just going to say is, listening to your story, Patricia, I can't get away from how different our lives have been, how different my life experience has been, my opportunities. And I hear people often talking about white privilege and whether it's a thing or not. And I listen to your story. And if this is about you today, it's not about me. But if I was to have just walked through my life experience, like my life journey, goodness me, you know, the difference could not be starker. I'm white. I was born into a very middle class family in a very rural part of the country that had almost entirely white community and school, and my experiences through life and through work could not be more different than the things you've dealt with and grappled with and fought through and kind of pushed through. And anyone that suggests that white privilege is not a thing, from my perspective, in my language, is not recognizing the kind of stark differences in life experience and chances, purely as a result of race and as a result of skin color. And I can say that from someone who's had that entirely kind of different experience. Interestingly, though, one thing that really resonated with me, when a commonality, an area of actual sort of common experience we do have that's shared, you talked about the Methodist kind of upbringing and that kind of side of things in terms of social justice. I was brought up in the Southwest. I was brought up in a family with a very strong Methodist background. My grandfather was a Methodist lay preacher, and he was one of the kindest, most gentle people in my life, and his impact in terms of that social justice and that perspective of what mattered had a huge profound impact, and still does, on me as well. And just interesting sometimes when you listen to, albeit two incredibly different stories and experiences, there are common things that kind of bind and motivate us through all of that.
Yeah.
And so, you know, just acknowledging that from my perspective. And the third thing, Patricia, that really kind of struck me that was so powerful in what you were saying, and actually this is another piece I think that brings all of us in the sort of roles that you and I share and others on this call hold as well in public life, is actually the role and the opportunity that we all have, whether it's from your personal lived experience, whether it's from an allyship perspective, from my kind of experience, that the duty on all of us to do something to address those very real things that you describe, frankly depressingly, but that is the reality, that those things have not moved and shifted anything like the degree that people will often want to pretend and suggest that they have. And I think we all have kind of roles on this call. And I really like what you describe in terms of that social movement across public service, because I think through us and through our staff and through organisations, we have a huge opportunity here to actually lead and be champions and advocates for change in that space. But I think the biggest takeaway for me, Patricia, from what I've just personally heard from you is, you know, just feeling very humbled personally at how totally different our experiences have been, largely because of the colour of our skins. And I think the fact that you said this wasn't about gender actually for you in many instances, but was kind of that kind of compounding thing around race. So thank you from me for sharing what you have, and a few kind of open personal reflections from me in response as well. I know there were a few hands that popped up as we went through the course of that, and I was keen to allow Patricia to run through in terms of her opening piece, but let's just turn to the room really now, the virtual room, because I know Patricia and I are both keen to open this out into a conversation. Would welcome comments or reflections on things that you've heard, questions you might have for Patricia or for any of others of us that might be on the call. And I'm particularly keen, Patricia, as we go through it, to try and kind of capture things that we can do something about as we move forwards and that we can all take out of this conversation, so this doesn't just become a conversation amongst us that stays on this call. I don't know if there's anything, Patricia, you'd like to say or to add before we kind of open things out more.
I'll try. No, well, first of all, I'm really sorry that I didn't last 25 minutes and I wasn't keeping my eye on the clock, but I'll try and answer as many questions as I can. I'm feeling a bit off centre today, I'll be really honest, because I went to a meeting yesterday to talk about some of this stuff, and as usual, the fragility of people in the room meant that it was a really difficult conversation, and that's had a bigger impact on me than I expected today. So just bear with me and I'll try and be as honest and open as I can.
Okay, thank you. And we will respect, and I'm sure colleagues will that as well. And certainly no one was going to kind of hold you to time in terms of the presentation piece, because it was far too important to hear what you had to say. So let me look to, I think, Diana, I'm looking at the raise hand function rather than so much the Q&A chat function, which I don't think we've been particularly using, though we've got a number of comments that have started to come through in terms of some thank yous through to here. Diana, is there anything you wanted to kind of point us to just first off from the chat function before looking to bring colleagues in?
Yes, just to say that we have got quite a few questions in the Q&A box, which we will filter through and raise those questions. But can I just please encourage our colleagues on the call, use the raise hand function, and as Toby and Patricia said, let's have this conversation. That's why we're here, to talk about race.
Diana, thank you. Let me, Patricia, just lift a couple of the comments or the questions that are out of the chat function here. So there's a question here around, we welcome your and other colleagues can get involved in the conversation here, responding as well, but your thoughts and views on how we can encourage more conversations around race within the workplace. And you started off quite rightly by saying we don't talk about this enough. What's your thoughts on how we turn that and how we change that within the workplace?
I think, first of all, that equality and inclusion needs to be the golden thread that runs through every organisation's people plan.
I think
Patricia may have just paused for a moment there, frozen on my screen. Patricia, you still with us?
Sorry, what happened there?
A momentary freeze.
That went a bit. So I think first of all, it needs to be the golden thread that runs through the people plan, and for it to be the golden thread that runs through the people plan, it has to be owned by the board. And when I was the chief executive of a provider, first of all, there was a lot of work done over a 12-month period with the board to get them to understand why this was so important and help them as individuals do the work on themselves around understanding where their thoughts and assumptions came from and how that needed to change. And then what then happened is the work programme around equality is owned by the board, not by your chief people officer or your HR team that, quite frankly, for me, shouldn't be leading it anyway. They're the conscience of the organisation. They need to hold the board to account for delivering on positive culture, not be leading it, and they can't mark their own homework. So there's something about the board owning it. And once the board owns it and the organisation starts to understand that this is a really core part of the people agenda, and the people agenda is essential to delivering the organisation's mission and vision, then you start to create a more positive environment and platform for those conversations to be had. And I think the other thing that, if I just link this to the first question, which is what are the sort of initiatives that benefit equality in organisations? I think there are three different things. There's the leadership question, which is getting the board ready to lead it, the board being committed to it, and then how do you translate that leadership development down to every level of the organisation? And again, you have to want to commit the time to it, because I hear a lot of people say to me, oh, but have we got time to put people into 6-month programmes to train them how to do something? Well, if we're going to ask everyone to deliver on 4 hours in A&E or manage flow better. We don't say, have we got time to put them into improvement events to be able to do it? But as soon as we talk about leadership behaviours and culture, we don't want to commit the time to it. And these things are critical to get organisations to function in the most positive way that they can. So I think the 3 things that you need to focus on are leadership behaviours at every level. And for us, that was a 6-module programme that ran over 6 months, where people were given literature to read beforehand to reflect on, and then they were brought in a room to discuss that literature. And the themes were about seeing the world differently, responding to what you now know in a different way, and how does that now translate into your leadership behaviours so that you lead the world, your teams differently, because you see the world differently. And something that one of my chief officers says all the time is that real change happens in real work. And one of my reflections back on running those programs of leadership development around compassion and inclusion were that people learn most in an environment where they were then thinking about how what they were learning in the moment would then translate into how they would lead their teams back at the ranch. The second element is around policy, and how do you create a set of people policies that are absolutely written through an inclusive lens and are written with a wide range of staff, including your network chairs, because then you really are starting with a blank piece of paper and writing them from a completely different perspective of trying to operate those policies in an environment that is an environment of trust. Because the NHS is really good at monitoring people within an inch of their lives, just in the hope they'll catch 5% of people out who are going to do something wrong. Well, why don't we just turn that on its head, actually, and trust everyone? Because 95% of those people will do the right thing most of the time. And so if we write policies from that perspective, that we'd only ever discipline someone or put them into a formal policy intervention for a very, very small number of really serious instances. And for the rest of the time, an OD intervention is the right thing to do to build relationships, and we get a different output. And we need to think really carefully about not just how we recruit people, but really challenge ourselves in terms of the way we view good and bad performance, the way that we view talent, because we see them through a very white Anglo-Saxon lens, and that means we judge our ethnic minority colleagues on standards that don't mean anything to them. You know, when we recruited lots of staff from overseas, trying to get the HR teams to understand that if you are coming to this country, you're also sending money home. It's probably the reason why you want to work on social hours, because you need to make as much money as you can if you're supporting a family here and a family where you've come from. Trying to get them to understand why an annual leave policy that says you can only have 2 weeks at a time when you might want to go back and see your family in Southeast Asia. Trying to get them to understand why, when you're going to have a conversation with someone who hasn't reached the right clinical standard, the way that you position that conversation is really important, because pride in what you achieve for some cultures might be much more important than it is in the UK. And then explaining to your family why you've gone to the other side of the world and now you're determined to have failed could lead to an adverse mental health event for you. The fact that the UK culture is based on individualism, which is why competition works so well and why we could learn so much from colleagues in South Asia and Africa, where cultures are based on collectivism, which lend themselves to partnership and collaboration. And why we insist on assessing people from Black and brown countries, because our assumption is that their clinical qualifications and their experience and their capability is not the same as if you're UK trained. When we don't do that to people who come from Australia, we don't do that to people that come from America, we don't do that to people that come from New Zealand. All of the countries that were previously in the empire, all of their clinical training programs are based on hours. And yet we have this view that when they come here, their knowledge and capabilities is substandard. So all of that has got to change. And then there's something around how we hold each other to account for the right behaviours. And that's where some of the conversations come in. They don't have to be hard and harsh conversations, but they do have to be where everyone feels confident and capable of holding each other to account. It's that difference between being a bystander and an upstander when you know that something is not right. And how do you create the right environment in organisations that enables people to feel as if they can challenge behaviours that are wrong, they can challenge value sets that are wrong, and that they will be supported to do that. And all those, for me, are a leadership task. They're about how the board sets the right environment and the right context for those things to happen in the right way.
Patricia, thank you for that, and for the question as well that was there in the chat function. I could see certainly your reference to the kind of role of boards and board functions. I could see Christian and Angela, two kind of board colleagues from our ICB here in Northamptonshire, nodding on screen at various points there as you were responding. I'm going to bring Diana. Am I able to bring people in technologically so they can speak as well as using the chat function? Because I can see, I think it's Arlene Miller has asked a couple of questions in the chat function, has also got a hand up as well. Are we able to do that?
Yeah, you'll be able to bring people in, Toby. And colleagues that have raised their hand to you, your microphone's been unmuted, so you'll be able to speak. So please join the conversation.
Is it me?
Yep, go for it. Come on in.
Hi, thank you, Patricia, for being where you are, for doing what you're doing, and for having this frank and honest talk. I'm hoping things will change because our children are coming up with the same issues. And, you know, hopefully change starts at the top and filters down. A question really regarding Black men on the wards, inpatient wards. What actions do you think need to take place for that to be less? What do you feel needs to happen at the forefront, be it when they're arrested, in a home life? What changes do you feel need to take place for this to be less of an issue than it is?
Gosh. I think there's something about the way that society views Black boys. It views them as adults way before they're adults and treats them as such. And a lot of that starts in the education system. So I think what we're talking about here in terms of what needs to happen in health, actually, when we think about the power of ICSs, I think there's something about how we influence the education sector in this space to start to see Black boys differently. I think there's then something about what we do around working with employers so that we are creating an environment where young boys see that they have opportunities in careers and in a vibrant economy that means that they're feeling part of society. And so what we're not then seeing is parts of society taking advantage of the fact that they feel ostracised and pulling them into areas that are not productive for them. And the idea that we hear all the time that this is all about single parent families is just, well, it's nonsense. It's about the way society treats them. So I think for me, it starts in the education system. It starts with the way that they are viewed in school. It starts with the way that they are treated in school, that leads to them feeling as if they don't belong in a place where they should belong. And we've got to do something about that. And I think we were only having this conversation actually in my integrated care system the other day, which is, whilst local authorities don't have any official authority over academies, it doesn't mean that within ICSs that we don't need to form a different relationship with our educational institutions. that not just makes sure that children are getting the best start in life and they're getting a good education, but changes some of these archaic attitudes to Black and brown children. And if you look at the educational curve, the exam curve, for an example, for young Black children, when their exams and their essays and their assignments are marked by people that know them, they perform below the average. And the minute that their exams move to being marked externally and anonymously, when they get into GCSE times, that curve changes, because the people that are marking their papers don't know who they are. So we've got to change the way that teachers are developed, the way that they're trained, and the way that they see different parts of society to really make a change in that space. When I think about, you only have to read David Harewood's book to start to see how mental health and the way that Black men in particular are treated and end up being sectioned in mental health, what impact that has on them. And again, I think there's work to do in all of our clinical services where we understand the needs of different parts of the community, and we don't use our assumptions and biases to make decisions. And that's not just in mental health, that cuts right across the health service, that we bring our worldviews into the workplace and they translate into the way that we care for the patients that we're here to look after. And again, that's got to fundamentally change. And for me, the reason why we need to do all this detailed work with our staff is because ED&I and health inequalities are intrinsically linked. You can't separate them. And if we're going to prepare our staff to understand the communities that they are here to serve and do the right thing, then that has to start with the relationships with each other in the workplace. Because once we start to get into an environment where people can have easy and free-flowing conversations about racism within the workplace, and we start to move the culture within teams, then we are then setting them up with the confidence and the knowledge and the expertise to interact with the communities that they're here to care for in the way that they should be. Does that answer your question?
I think
It
I can
does.
see
Thank you very much.
And Arlene, I should have said, it'd be great if people could introduce themselves as well as they're coming through. Just let us know, who are you and where do you join us from today?
Hi, so I'm Arlene Miller and I'm the new Business Support Manager for Northampton Community Mental Health Team.
Pleased to
Nice
meet
to meet
you.
You too, thank you.
And we're not related because she's a Miller with an A. I just need to say that.
Yeah, I'm a Miller.
So let's look. I think we've got a number of other hands that have come up, and I'm going to focus on the hands because I think it just helps the conversation. I'll come back and look and scan through the kind of chat box as well in a moment for some comments that might be in there. So who am I turning to next? And I should say apologies if I get any names the wrong way around. I'm never quite sure. Team sometimes places them in different orders. I think, is it Kamal Garani? I think I've got next.
Hi, yes, it is Toby. Hi, I'm Kamal Garania. I'm the Senior Commissioning Lead for CVD and Respiratory at Northamptonshire ICB. So I joined the ICB in October, and just a comment really. So thank you, Patricia, for sharing your experiences. It felt comforting in the wrong way of a sense to hear that somebody had an experience that I could relate to in some forms in terms of some of my previous workplaces actually. So in terms of background, my parents moved to a predominantly white upper class area and were working class Indian. My dad's African Indian descent. My dad was actually moved to the UK after they were expedited from Uganda in Africa, and my mum came over here to marry him, and they were childhood sweethearts in short. But my mum didn't speak a word of English. Now when people meet and speak to my mum, they can't believe that she came here at the age of 18 and did not know a word of English, because her vocabulary, her accent and everything is great. But we had a very different experience growing up and being the corner shop family, and the only Asian family within the area, actually. I went to and got into a very good school based on the location that I was in, but I was one of, I think, 400 students, and I think only 8 of us were of BME. There were no full Black students at all. There were a few who were Pakistani, and I was the only Indian, actually. And it felt odd moving from where I'd grown up to Northampton 5 years ago when I got married, which is actually very different in terms of diversity. And I remember calling my husband on my first week in Northampton and saying, wow, there are lots of Indian people here. And he said, what do you mean? You are one. And I said, I know, I've never seen this many before. And then I started working at Northamptonshire ICB, and it's been a really good experience so far, but there have been some things as an advocate of BME that I didn't know were different for me, because I previously worked in North Central London ICB, and London is obviously a lot more diverse as it is. So seeing a lot more people who looked like me is the only way that I could put it. I haven't ever worked in a workplace really and seen many people who look like me, and I've always found that quite interesting. And I must have mentioned it to a colleague, and the colleague's response was, but we're doing better than other places in the Midlands. And I was actually quite upset with that, because I felt like that wasn't the, just because we're doing better doesn't mean we're there yet. And I'm really keen, Toby, to work as part of the ICB as a kind of champion and work with teams to look at what we could perhaps do to kind of change things in that sense. I think the other thing that I found would have been really nice for me from a personal experience again is I think it was the first few weeks that I started, it was Diwali, which is obviously the equivalent of Christmas, and I didn't really see anything about it at work. And there have been workplaces where people don't do a lot, but I've also worked in workplaces where they do really celebrate things that are as big as Eid, Diwali, Chinese New Year. And again, as my part of my role, I have put myself forward in the staff forum, and I would really advocate for these sorts of things to move forward as well, to add some inclusiveness in the workplace. I think the biggest thing for me is I am currently obviously being quite open and honest at an 8B level. When I started working in CCG back then, not Northamptonshire, this is another organisation, I started as a band 4 and as an admin, and I was told in an indirect way from my senior team member, who was middle-aged white woman at the time, that I would never make it to being an 8A or above for the reason of my background and race. Interestingly enough, the same member of staff went on maternity leave, and when she came back, I'd gone from a 4 to a 7, so I was kind of halfway there. And the same member of staff, I think, now knows that I'm an 8B from just links within the NHS system, and part of me looks back at that and thinks, well, I did what you said I couldn't, but then the other part of me thinks, did I do that subconsciously to prove a point that somebody like me can do it? Again, I'm sure that it's the same for a lot of ethnicities. For my parents, it's a really big deal that I'm doing the job that I'm doing. My parents take it 100%. They ring every single person they know every time I get a promotion, because for them, they couldn't even get an education. Sorry. They couldn't get an education. So
I can absolutely understand.
It is a big deal.
It's a big deal. And that's why I say to people, when we're about to tell people who come from other countries that they're not meeting the mark, Need to think really carefully about how we handle that conversation, because that can be the be all and end all for them in terms of why they're here and how their family view them as being successful or not. And some of look, at the end of the day, we must remember that when colleagues tell us that, oh, things are better here than they are somewhere else, or they're not as bad as they are down the road, we need to remember that racism is this idea that things have gotten better over the years is absolute nonsense. Racism has not always existed. When you look back to the Roman times, the Romans hated everybody that wasn't a Roman. They didn't hate you because of the colour of your skin. That's why there were black generals. Racism was a construct that was created in order to justify slavery. It's that black and white. It has not always existed. So no, things have not got better over time. They've actually got worse, because pre-slavery, we didn't have racism. So this idea that it's better here than it is down the road, it's like saying this bucket leaks less than the one that you've got. It's not good enough anywhere, and there is nowhere in the NHS that is making significant inroads into race equality, because the RES report tells us that every single day. So there's one thing that you can do to really help people understand from a more practical perspective what it's like being BAB. And there's a lady, and I will remember her name because I can't remember her name. I think she's called Jane Kelly, but I'll remember and send you her details. You can watch some of her films, or they're educational, from the 1980s. She was a white professor in the States, came before Robin DiAngelo, and she tried to get people to realise what it was like to be black in America. And we should not believe for 1 minute that what it's like there is not what it's like here, because it is. It's just that we don't show it on TV every 5 minutes. And she did an experiment where she brought people into the theatre for an Oprah Winfrey show, and she said to everyone, if you've got blue eyes, go one way. If you've got green eyes, go another. And what happens to those people is, if you've got one colour of eyes, you're treated like kings, you're given breakfast before you come in, you've got the best seats, it's all wonderful and comfortable. If you've got a different colour of eyes, they take you into a room, they don't feed you, there's not enough chairs, they make you sit on the floor, and then when you come into the studio, there's nowhere for you to sit, so you're sat on the floor in the aisles. And what she's trying to get them to see is that different communities are treated differently, and what does it feel like? And what it did, that an argument in the studio, because people couldn't understand why they were treated so differently. They couldn't understand why they were dehumanized. And then she explains to them why she's done it. So it's my husband here giving me a name called Jane Elliott.
Oh, thank you. I have to say, on the flip side of things, and the positive is, I am now a parent, and my son is being raised in Northampton. And I have to say, in a contrasting experience to what I had at nursery, where I went in not speaking English as my first language, because for my parents it was easier to teach me our home language first, so that I wouldn't forget it or not be able to pick it up. And they often got called into nursery because they didn't understand what I was saying, and they were a bit worried about I was talking by the age of 2, fully speaking sentences, so I don't know why they were concerned, but they were a bit worried about my developments. In contrast, my son's nursery, which is in Northampton, have asked me for a book with pictures of words that he uses to make sure that they stay consistent with his home language. And I was just blown away by that. And I know in a way I shouldn't be, but I was blown away by the fact that they were being so inclusive. And they even asked me for a calendar of all of the things that he celebrates in terms of religious festivals, so that at nursery they could share that with all of the children that are there. And I actually thought that was really nice, because they're doing it for all of the children in the nursery. But again, it seems like things that we shouldn't be so happy to see. It should just be normal, but it was nice to see that.
But seeing people that look like us, it's part of the journey. It's not the whole journey. It's important, but it's important that when we do create diverse teams, that they feel welcome in the organisation. Otherwise, all we do is crack the representation question, and then people leave because they arrive and realise that the environment's not conducive to them thriving. And there are 42 ICSs in England. I am the only BME chief executive in that group. So every month when we all meet with the senior leadership team from NHS England, I am the only brown face in the room. That does not feel comfortable. It doesn't feel comfortable for me. It's fine for the other 41 in the NHS England leadership team, but it's not okay for me. And nobody recognises that that's not okay for me.
Patricia, I'd just like to respond as well, Kamal, to a couple of the comments that you made. I mean, firstly, thank you for sharing what you have, for both a combination of sharing and asking a question through that as well. I'm delighted that we've got you in the organisation, and you're getting involved in the staff forum is brilliant. Just to make an offer, I would really welcome a sit down and just hearing a bit more firsthand, if you were open to it, some of your experiences and thoughts on how we can do more as an organisation, because I absolutely don't buy whoever it was that said that we're doing kind of better than other people. A, I don't recognise that, and B, even if I did, that's frankly not a helpful lens to look at this from. So if you're open to that, come and find me and let's kind of sit down and have a conversation. But thank you for sharing what you have in this forum.
Of course, thanks, Toby.
Let me bring in a few other folks. I can see we've got a number of other hands. I think I've got, is it Hina Naik that's been waiting a little while patiently? If I can bring you in, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Hina Naik, Assistant CIO, so Chief Information Officer at Midlands and Lancashire. So I work in quite a back office function, not front line. So I can see many of you are front line type sort of positions that you hold. I think it was, as opposed to a question, just a few comments really on reflections on the discussion so far, and then just some comments about how we might take it forward. I think that for me, like Patricia says, it's not just about responding to something like the RES report. It is about fundamentally changing the culture around inclusivity, and that inevitably means that that's inclusivity of everybody. So it is about everyone. I think obviously there has to be acknowledgement of the underrepresentation of BME folks in certain positions. So within our CSU, for instance, we do very well up to a certain grade, and then it just drops off. It's almost non-existent. I think another comment I would make is that alluding to a lot of the conversation people have had. So I'm sorry if this is coming out a bit garbled, because it is quite emotive. So it's quite difficult to get your point across quite succinctly. But in terms of everything that we've talked about today, and that's only just, an hour and a half, you are going back sometimes to societal constructs. So how do we view Black boys? That is, and so it is very easy in a workplace to sit there and say, well, that's not us, that's society, and that's how it has always been. But I think what I would try and, so what happens then is that workplaces say, oh yeah, but then it just becomes tokenistic, we don't need to do anything. So some of this is about building organisations that have much more of a moral conscience, a social conscience, to try and reach out as far as we can. Of course, we can't change the construct around Black boys overnight. However, we can start to have the discussions. And what I would say is, in terms of even just trying to touch the tip of this iceberg, and I'm not saying we've cracked it or anything like that, I'm saying that starting small is okay. Do small things, and actually you will get a lot of momentum behind that, but you have to have that leadership at the top level. Another thing I would say from my own personal experience is that, and I don't know if this is not quite the right thing to say, but I am going to say it because it's pretty an open forum. I think we've got to look after leaders or aspiring leaders in the BME category, because there is something around. So for instance, from my experience, just a couple of just personal experiences around, I'm not white, obviously. I haven't grown up in a middle class, family. It wasn't affluent. So what happens though is, so when you enter a workplace that is more corporate or normal, you have this self either hate or doubt or limitation placed on yourself in your own head. And I think that is a really important thing. So what happens is it comes back to something Patricia said, which is you have to be steely. You have to be really, really steely to move forward. Me and my sister will often joke, and it's not really a joke. We will say, and especially as COVID happened, when you're on Zoom calls, we used to practice softening our faces. Because actually, when a brown woman or a black woman says something that's a little bit challenging, I think we're perceived as threatening, but also we start to question ourselves. And when I do that, when I enter challenging conversations, I feel more brown. So even the words I am using brown like it's a bad thing, and it isn't. So I think there's something around support for leaders who are potentially grappling with that. Sometimes and I'm Asian, so I think on the spectrum, there's this view that Asians are hardworking. There's this sort of Asian ethic around working hard, giving loads to your employer, doing all that. And I think that does me well in an organization like this, right? But if I wasn't in that category and I was a black boy, I do often sit and reflect on the basis that I have now got a black child who looks black. I do often wonder, how do they get up in the morning and carry on? Because this must be tough. You must be thinking about this all the time. So I think there's something around that as well, in terms of I'm just trying to sort of open up to, how am I going to take this forward as a very senior member in the CSU? And it's about not ignoring it because it's too big. It's about doing something. And I think it is that, those three elements of inclusivity, support for those leaders. It's not just you should be grateful because you're there now, and that kind of acknowledgement that we can't solve it all, but we can certainly start somewhere. So it was just more comments rather than questions.
Yeah, I absolutely understand where you're coming from, and I think that I'd say three things. That when people say they've experienced racism, believe them until you know otherwise, because this idea that people regularly play the race card is just a nonsense. It just really is. So you need to believe them, because we know what it feels like, what it smells like, what it looks like. I've lost count the amount of times I've been called emotional, aggressive. I mean, God knows how many negative words when I've voiced an opinion on something. And it's even worse for black men. I just walked down the road one day with me and my husband, and see how people respond to him. We live obviously we live near the seaside now. He no longer goes jogging, because if he goes jogging at certain times of the day or night, he will be stopped and searched, because there'll be an assumption that he's up to no good rather than jogging. He drives an old-fashioned family car, because if he doesn't, he will be stopped and searched by the police, that assumes that he's into county lines or a drug dealer. We'll get on the train together, and people will not sit next to me if I'm wearing braids. They won't sit next to him, whatever he's wearing. So this is a regular occurrence in this country. This is not something that just happens in other places. So we've got to start to recognise that. And a colleague said to me once that, which made me think a lot actually, about the fact that she is married to a white man, and she'd said to him one day, "Tell me what it's like being white." And he said, "I don't know what you mean. What do you mean? What's it like being white?" And she said, and therein lies the problem, because you don't have to think about it when you get up in the morning. But the first thing I think about when I get up in the morning is the colour of my skin, because it's going to dictate every interaction that I have every day of the week. So it's just being conscious.
I mean, I still go, when I book a holiday, I Google, and it sounds mental, but it is true. I Google whether that area is racist.
Well, of course you do, but people don't understand that there are places where we would never dream of going on holiday. Because we're not welcome. Just not welcome. And that's not just in this country, that's overseas. We're not welcome.
Patricia, you're certainly very welcome here. I'm really mindful of your time and of colleagues' time on the call. I think we're scheduled to run till about 1:45, and we've got 3 other colleagues with hands up. Can I make a suggestion that if you're okay just for a couple of minutes that I just ask, because I'm really keen for people who wanted to participate to just ask those 3 colleagues to either comment or kind of pose a question and then come back to you as a group. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine. I don't know what anyone else has got in terms of time, but I've not got another appointment till 3.
Well, let's keep running a little bit then, because I can certainly do that. And this is an important conversation. If other people do need to drop off, we'll understand as we go through this. So let me bring in. I've got, I think, Tracy and Bunthu, and then I think I've got Rashmi. So in that order, if you 3 folk would like to sort of come in, perhaps a quick introduction, and then either a kind of comment or question, and then I'll come to Patricia as a group of those.
Hi everyone. Hi Patricia. I'm Tracy Robson. I am the People Director at Northampton General Hospital. I'm also very privileged to work with Diana Belfont in our ED&I subgroup here in our system. Thank you so much. You really have made me think. I think as a white person, doesn't really matter. I'm not going to go into my background, but I'm working class and proud. I want to make that clear. But the things that you have said have made me realise that, because I'm sitting, I've got a ton of emotions going through me. I almost hesitated to put my hand up because I'm thinking, right, how do I engage in this? Because some of the things in your slides that really stuck with me, particularly in your conclusions around flipping actually some of the assumptions and some of the stuff that you read out there around the whole piece around what gets measured gets done, the kind of myths, as I might call them, and what white people, your white colleagues, can do to take up that baton and being intentional. But I think what you've made me think is, because some of the things that you've talked about valuing kind of a diverse workforce and really grabbing that and learning it and making it kind of intentional in terms of what culture you cultivate. And I'm not going to go to the societal things because, of course, goodness, shocking, you know, I'm quite old, you know, and the very fact that I'm hearing that some of, you know, our kids still behave like that, that your kids still experience that is just shocking. But bringing it back to the workplace where, you know, as a relatively senior leader, how I can make a difference. What I think I need is good guidance, because it's got to be put into careful hands. Don't want to do anything tokenistic. I'm very lucky that I've got some really good people that, like Diana, some really good colleagues from different backgrounds. I also worked in a company before where I was across 60 markets. And so, you know, I was working with a diverse workforce and I really enjoyed that. But these are quite interesting times, I think, to put what is quite an uncomfortable conversation on the table and how we need to exchange and talk about those things that we can change it. I absolutely agree with you that it's systemic. So it means it's got to be woven through everything that you do. And people like me, engaging with people like you, Patricia, and some of the stories that people have told. One of the best things that happened to me was somebody did an exercise where it was like standing in a line. I'm sure some of you know it. And I was in this line. If this has happened to you, because we've all got stories, you know, and then you get to a certain point, you think, well, God, that's never happened to me. That's never happened to me. But if you are, and I believe everything you've said is right about where this has to start and the conversation. If we really mean it and you're really intentional about it, then you need the right mentorship and guidance and insight. And you need to have some, like you said, Patricia, you know, and Toby responded, but where you sit and what you're feeling is not something that others in that group will be feeling. So getting to the right people to have the right insight and the right education so that we can exchange a conversation and make changes really made me think, definitely need to educate myself more and continue learning, continue engaging with the right people to help you call out and come to things like, no, that is racism, rather than perhaps, you know, just thinking, you know, I think it's really opened my eyes to, and I'm a bit of a reflector, so I need to reflect and go away, but I do think it is about, you need to make sure you're getting the input from the right people who have the insight and the experience to be able to table it. And I am kind of interested in where we would go for that, where we should get it. I'm sure even, you know, our teams, our people who've got those experiences, bringing them forward, because it is stories that partially contribute to changing culture, isn't it? And if you haven't heard any of that, if you haven't touched that, if you haven't seen it, then, you know, you need to open your eyes, basically. As a white person, I need to open my eyes, I need to educate myself, and I need to be guided. It's not something white people on their own can do, is it? It's something that we've got to do in partnership. But it has been a real start, and I've loved your style and just putting it on the table and being really direct, because I think that's what needs to happen. So I just want to say that, because I am feeling a bit, oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that I think you're right. This is not an easy journey, and if we're embarking on it and thinking it's easy, it's not. And don't expect that you're going to start on a program of change and within 12 months you're going to get this massive uptick on your staff survey results and it's all going to be okay. There are no quick wins in any of this. It's a steady culture program of work that it took my last organisation 3 years before we saw a step change in the staff survey results, because this stuff takes time. People don't change their view of the world in 5 minutes. I think you've got to, the task for everyone is yes, intellectually you might think this is absolutely the right thing to do, but unless you connect with it on a much deeper level, on an emotional human being to human being level, the intellectual connection will get you nowhere, because you have to connect with it emotionally. Because when you start to understand the experience of others, for white colleagues, you will feel uncomfortable for a while, and that is okay. It's not okay for anybody to try and stop you feeling uncomfortable, because the fact you feel uncomfortable and you sit with that uncomfortableness for a while is what will spur you on to do more work on yourself and understand what really happens for your colleagues, and then you'll be in a much better place to do something about it. And so I referred earlier on to Robin DiAngelo, which some of you will know and some of you won't. And you can read her books on white fragility, and you can, you know, there's webinars online that are her talking about her book. But when I read that book for the first time, I cried buckets of tears, because that book validates everything that I have felt for the last 50 years. Because every time someone has said to me, are you really sure that person meant it like that? Are you really sure they were being racist? And I have gone away and doubted myself. That book validated everything that I thought deep down inside was driving the responses to me that I wasn't able to articulate properly. So when you read that book, it will make you feel uncomfortable, but you have to read it in the context of acknowledging that you will have done and said those things in your life, not because you're a bad person or the intention behind it has been bad, but because the conversation that might have followed will have been difficult and uncomfortable, and so you've tried to shut it down quickly.
Patricia, thank you for that response, and Tracy for the comments and questions. I've got 2 other people that want to come in, and Patricia, just to give you a heads up, I've got a question for you as well that I'd like you to come back to. I felt uncomfortable a little while back when you talked about how you feel when we all get together in London or wherever we happen to get together, and we've got 42 of us as system chief execs across the country, and we've got NHS England, and I was sat thinking about what you said and about the balance in the room and the colour in the room, and I'd just be interested if there's anything, what if anything can I and other colleagues do in that kind of space to, in that particular moment, in those kind of particular rooms. But let me just bring in, I've got Buntu, and then I've got Rashmi, in that order, if I can, please. If we're able to unmic.
Is it better?
Yes, we've got you now. Yeah, brilliant.
Hi. Hi, my name is Buntu. I'm right now I'm in no man's land. I first met Diana when I was one of the first members for Worst Rate Equality strategy. I was representing from East London Foundation Trust. So I think first I just wanted two questions. How do you find clearly there is a lot of pressure on you? How do you find what is your coping strategy? Because this is hardest work. I mean, you are top of your game and there's so few of you. So yeah, I guess that's the question. How do you find the balance? Because there is within the BME community there, for the notion I'm trying to kind of formulate is, and it's a cliche, but I'm gonna work with it anyway, just for 1 minute. Does all Black lives matter within, so the outsider within the outsider? For example, I was a nurse. I'm still a nurse, but I had to walk away from it because most of there, of course, the struggle that I felt in my career so far is the disconnect between Black on Black. Most of the struggles that I faced was the outsiderism because of how I represent and how I show up as a black gay man, for example, working in the NHS, and the disconnect and how from my Black colleagues the struggles that I had to face. Now, for me, I had to walk away from that. So that's not about me. I guess you're in it. You're more courageous than I am. So how do you find? How do you find? Because you clearly, it's as your colleagues just kind of said to you, that clearly he's realizing that there are struggles that he might not have been aware of. Why do you do it, and how do you continue to do it? Because I'm finding that a bit of a struggle, especially when it comes from the disconnect or the discrimination I find from Black on Black, an issue that we haven't really kind of discussed here.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is absolutely recognise what you're saying, and the intersectionality will play a role all the way through this, because none of us have a single identity. None of us have a single protected characteristic, and so we've got to think about how those things overlap and how intersectionality plays out. I think when we think about the relationship between race and sexuality, there is a lot of history through colonialism where many of the countries that our parents and grandparents have originated from had quite often forced on them religious views that weren't evident before colonialism. And whilst the West has in some places moved on from those religious views, particularly the ones that were homophobic, some of our countries of origin have not. And we need to start to address that in the workplace, because it's not okay to say to everyone that race equality has to be in existence and then say, but it's okay if within the context of that we're homophobic, because it isn't. So when we talk about, I actually don't like the phrase inequality, because I think we need to change the language that we use and talk about cultures of pro-equity and health equity, because then we're not getting into the argument that we get a lot, which is if you take something away, you're taking something away from one group in order to give it to another, because we're not. What we're trying to achieve is equity for everyone, and that means treating people in a differential way in order to enable them to reach a stage of equality, and that's very subtly different. Why do I keep doing it? God, I was asking myself that question yesterday afternoon after a really crap meeting on it. Because however difficult it is, no matter how difficult it is, social justice matters. And if we all give up there's nobody, we're not fighting for each other, and we're never going to we won't make big steps. I agree with colleague earlier on. Sometimes it's about small steps that each one of us can take that make society better. And no matter how, sometimes you have to also, I'm never going to judge you for walking away, because you have to also determine what you need to do to self-care and what the line is before you actually need to just step back, because pushing forward is more detrimental to you than it is about the change that you can make. And I go through moments where it's too hard in my head, because lots of people ask me to do lots of things, because I am one of only 42. And when I was a provider chief exec, I was one of 9 out of 231, which is even more appalling. So yeah, sometimes I think this is bloody too hard, but then I think, actually, if I don't do it, who else is going to step into that space? And what we want to do is get to a situation where there are lots of people like me in senior roles, so that actually it's not dependent on a small number of people to speak the truth, and where more and more of our colleagues like Toby and like Angela that are white allies step into that space and do the speaking for us, actually, because that's when it becomes really powerful. And so how do I keep going? One, because I've got really good colleagues. So I talked about Krishna earlier on. I co-chair the BME Chairs and Chief Executives Network, and half of our meeting every other month is about business and how we can influence things, and the other half of the meeting is, quite frankly, therapy, where we talk about our experiences and how it feels. And that safe space to do that is really, really important. The other thing I think is about how you keep yourself going is it's about family, because at the end of the day, amongst all this noise, family is what matters, and it keeps you grounded. And so if I ever want to remember that, how difficult it is, but there's something worthwhile carrying it on for, it's my daughters. They keep me grounded. When I'm going to give up, like I said, I had a rubbish day yesterday, and my 15-year-old said, "Yeah, okay, Mum, let's get over it, because the fight carries on." It's for them, because I don't want them to have the same experiences as adults that I've had. I want something to be different, and so I feel like on that basis I've not got any choice, and I want it to be different for their children, because 400 years since slavery started and not much has changed, because we're always told it's not the right time, or we want to move too quickly, or yada yada yada. Something's got to change, and if we're going to get it to change at a faster pace, then we need to think how we do that collectively. So one of the conversations we had at the network last week was, how can we engage the head of the BME Police Federation? How can we engage the head of the BME Fire Service? So we're starting to create a movement of public sector organisations to say, actually, something's got to be different.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.
Guntu, thank you very much for the questions and comments. And Patricia, I'm super mindful of time. We've used your extra 15 minutes as well, which means we're probably about to kind of hit the. Can we take one final question? Is that okay with you? Just because I'm really keen to make sure we don't kind of cut anyone off who wanted to contribute. I'm going to bring Rashmikant in and then come back to you, Patricia, for sort of any response to that, final comments, a couple of quick words from me, and then we'll draw things together for today. So Rashmikant, over to you.
Hello. Oh, sorry. Oh, God.
No, you're on. Oh, we've lost you now, though.
Am I there?
Yeah.
Am I there? Yeah.
We are.
Hello.
We've got you.
Hello. Okay. I'm a Kathleen General Hospital governor, and I'm also, a disabled guide dog owner. So one of the things that, one of the barriers is that what you do or to their presentation, I had no idea of the slides, what you were talking about, other than just listening to you. So I think that one of the barriers that people doesn't always think about, that when blind people are part of the, we're talking about health inequalities straight away, let alone being from an Asian minority person, but as a disabled person, it's additional inequality. But anyway, what I'm interested in, and I'm interested from the service point of view, how you said you talk about, changing movement, influencing, right and listen to all these words you use. I'm interested in, from the commissioning services to delivery and access, how you think, how do you feel this can be really going to make a change in this, let alone as an overall ICS, as all 40 or 42 of your ICS, but even this within this county, which is directly impacts me and a lot of the Asian organization communities live in this county, because I say we feel that not really, as you said, the leadership starts at the board all across, and what I keep hearing that only it's so far, and then it's up to left to the each sort of boards and each collaboratives and all like that. So how do you think that we're singing all from the start to finish it's the same hymn shit that you're talking about?
So what? I'm sorry, I'm not following the question. What do you want to ask me? Do you want to ask me how we move from commissioning to delivery in a way that values all communities? Is that what you're asking me?
Yes.
Okay,
yeah, and also part of the question is that when you talk about the leadership, how it is translated all the way within ICS from the collaboratives to all across, so they're all across it's the same hymn sheet.
Okay. So, God, Toby, I think this is a question for you, really.
Well, I was going to say, it's a huge question at kind of 3 minutes past 3, and it's probably as well something we might actually want to follow up locally, Rashmikant, as well. I'd be more than happy to meet and come out and kind of see and sort of meet wherever that was helpful and appropriate for you. So quick responses and initial thoughts, Patricia, but it's probably something as well that we can follow up. Diana, I'm sure you can help connect us as well as we come off the call. So
when we talk about leadership, I'm not just talking about leadership within organisations, it's leadership development around equality and inclusion right across the ICB. And Toby and Toby's chief people officer and a colleague and the teams will be thinking about that already. When we think about what that then means to commissioning and delivery, so one of the things that we have to do, and I'm, to be honest, I'm a bit disappointed that we're told we have to do it, because for me we should be doing it anyway, which is the engagement and the engagement, the people and people's engagements policy that we're supposed to follow talks about embedding what we call co-production into the way that ICSs develop their plans and then decide on how they're going to commission and deliver services. And so I had a hand in writing that policy with Olivia Butterworth, because I have a bit of an obsession with the fact that I think we quite often in public service take a paternalistic view and decide what populations need and then tell them we're going to give it to them, and don't really truly engage with them to understand their lived experiences. So in my ICS, our community wrote our integrated care strategy that we're now working through with them. How do we deliver it? So what we did was we did a replication of what has happened in Wigan with the Wigan deal. And we trained lots of staff from health, local government and the third sector to embed themselves in the community over a period of months, so they could hold conversations with as many members of our community as possible. And the instructions they were given was, it's not a two-way conversation that we want you to have, it's a one-way conversation where you listen only to what the lived experiences of our communities and what are the barriers to them achieving good health and well-being, and what do they want from public service. And the consequence of that was that they said to us, we don't actually want to talk about health, We want to talk about all the services that exist in the community that need to be strengthened, that stop us having to interact with the health service as often as we do. So they said things to us like, stop calling us a patient because we're not a patient, we're a person. Stop seeing us as the disease that we present with. Start seeing us as an individual that has a whole life history that's taken us to where we are now in terms of our health and well-being. Can you do something to strengthen community networks? Because those are the things that keep us going when things get tough, and developing a sense of belonging within the communities that we live in. And can you please strengthen non-statutory service? Because in actual fact, when we're recovering from physical or mental ill health, we go there first before we go to the health service or local government. So the next stage is, how do you then craft a set of service offers around those things that matter, that will make a step change into prevention and early help, as opposed to being responsive to ill health? And the next phase is then we go back out to our community and work with them on what those solutions are. And hopefully that will answer the question that you're asking me, and it will produce a different result.
I think it does. Because why I raise this, because what is within the organization, it reflects on decision making. And people, if they haven't got, so this is how, because when it comes to people who are within organization and you have an issue, then because it's the same thing translates into how you are, your mind thinking and how you're making decisions. And this is what really, it's a key. I know this is more from an organization point, but I just wanted to see in the sense that what you just said, but I think so far you develop cooperating principle, and yes, we're doing it, but I think how specifically, in the sense that if we really tackle and want to tackle racism, then overall as an ICS, we have one officer, whatever, but how you are engaged forming that specific race equality policy strategy with the community organization, because this doesn't seem like to me so far yet that's how I feel anyway.
Rashmi, sorry, Patricia, to come back in again. I was just going to say, more than happy to follow up separately, because I'd be interested in exploring, particularly given the local Northampton perspective, the conversation a bit further, if Diana could pick that up with us. We have got Patricia in our ICB, our board next Thursday, has got our community engagement framework coming back into the board, which the comms and engagement team hosted at NHFT have been helping work with us on. The conversation here today actually has been really helpful in triggering some thoughts from my perspective to take into that. But as I say, very, very happy, Rashmi, to follow that up. I am mindful that, not surprisingly, we've got dwindling numbers, because we've been we've kept Patricia in the kind of hot seat for an hour and a 3/4 or so, getting up towards the 2-hour mark. So I am going to draw things to a close, if that's okay at this point. Patricia, I'll come back to you when we're in London next time round over coffee, and I'll pick up on my question to you, because I would really welcome your thoughts in terms of how I and others can kind of help in that space. But for now, let me just say a huge thank you for being so generous with your time, so open in sharing your lived experiences, and so powerful in the way that you've done it, and so thought-provoking in terms of the kind of comments and responses you've made in engaging with people. I'm just going to pause for a moment to allow a virtual round of applause across the screen, which I can see coming across in a wave, and I will physically do my kind of clap here. Patricia, if you'd like to add anything by way of final closing comments, but you probably just need to get a glass of water and
just thank you to Diana for reaching out, because we'd have never got here if it hadn't been for that. And I've really enjoyed the conversation. And if there's ever anything I can do to help, then just let me know. I always enjoy a visit back to Bedford. I've still got friends there, so.
Excellent. Well, look, thank you very much, and Patricia, have a good weekend when you finally get to it. And look, for everyone else, thank you for joining and for your engagement and contributions. Look forward to kind of continuing to work together and take these conversations forward across wherever you've dialed into today across the country. So take care, everyone. Stay safe and have a good weekend. Thank you all. Bye, folks.
Thank you, Patricia.